Hey everyone, Jay here, and welcome to Loops. What are loops? Oftentimes, you're writing a computer program, and computers are really good at doing the same repetitive thing over and over and over again. We're going to make a loop, and we're going to say, do this thing over and over and over again. What thing would we do over and over again? Doesn't matter. Anything, okay? We're not talking about the thing inside the loop. We're talking about how to make the loop today. All right. So let's start with a simple loop, right? There are two main types of loop, a while loop and a for loop. There's also a do while loop. We're not going to use a do while loop. Technically, you never need to use a do while loop, and I'll tell you why. While loop, this first while loop is just going to count from 1 to 10 and output the numbers from 1 to 10. That's it. All right. There's two parts to a loop, three if you count the initialization that comes before the loop, okay? So I'm going to initialize my variable before the loop, okay? That's the pre-loop part of the loop. The actual parts of the loop, first part is the loop condition. So here I have a while loop, and my loop condition is while my variable countdown is less than or equal to 10. So I've initialized it to 0. So that's less than or equal to 10. My loop is going to happen at least once. The next part of the loop is the loop body. That's all this right here. It's all the stuff that's inside the loop, and that's where you actually do something in your loop. We're not going to do anything important. We're just going to count from 1 to 10. Okay. I've called the variable countdown because the first loop that I wrote counted down from 10 to 1. This one's easier. So the body of the loop, in our case, we're just going to print the value of countdown, okay? And then we're going to, oh, this is actually going to count from 0 to 10. Great. And then we're going to add 1 to the countdown. Maybe we should set that to 1. So we'll count from 1 to 10. So initialize to 1. Then we're going to add 1 to our countdown. Countdown plus equals 1. And then at the end of the loop body, the control of the program goes back up to the loop condition and tests again. If it tests positive, we execute the loop body again. And then we go test again. Eventually, if you programmed it correctly, eventually it will evaluate to false, okay? And hopefully you can tell that my simple loop here will eventually be, the countdown variable will eventually be greater than 10, which is not less than or equal to 10. And eventually this loop condition will evaluate to false. When it does evaluate to false, the loop body is not going to execute one more time. It's simply going to end, and then control the program goes to the next line right outside the loop body. In my case, it's this blank line, and then a print statement with nothing in it that prints a blank line. I like to print blank lines in my output so that things are separated and they look nice. The output's for humans. So that's it. That's a loop. Thanks, everybody. See you next time. No, we've got a lot more. Hopefully not too much. So that's a loop. We have our while. That's the keyword. Don't forget this colon here at the end of the loop condition. All right, that's important. And don't forget to indent everything down here. Very important, especially in Python. Things need to be indented properly or they don't work. Okay, so everything in the loop body is indented one tab. And we have our colon right here. If you're using a different programming language, the syntax will be slightly different. Refer to that language. I'm only going to teach one language at a time today. That's it. That's the while loop. Next, I'm going to do the exact same loop, but I'm going to use a for loop. Now, the main difference between a for loop and a while loop is a while loop will loop until this condition is met. Great. A for loop will loop iteratively through a collection of things. Okay. You could just set the for loop like I have in my case to just loop through some numbers with a starting point and an ending point. Totally fine. Or later on when we have actual lists and arrays of things, the for loop can loop through that list of things. And we don't need to know how long the list is. The for loop can just do it. Whereas the while loop could do it. It just takes a little bit extra steps to get it right. Okay, so for loop makes some loop types a lot easier. Right? And I did mention a do while loop previously. The do while loop is just like the while loop, except we put the condition at the end and we say do all this while, put the condition at the bottom. And so the do while loop will always do it once, at least once, and then assuming the loop condition at the end evaluates to true, it will keep executing multiple times, but it will always do it at least once. In the while loop and in the for loop, depending on what the condition is, it might actually execute 0 times and never execute this body. Right? If I initialize the countdown variable to 10 and I ran this, it would happen 0 times. And it's totally fine. Sometimes that happens. Sometimes you put a loop in and your initial value doesn't pass the loop condition and you don't loop. That's okay, assuming that it's okay with your goals of your program. All right. Sometimes you actually don't need the loop when you get down to the loop. It's fine. Okay. But how does the for loop work? All right. So we say it's a for loop. I'm going to give it a variable as a temporary variable. Generally in for loops or in while loops, we're using an iterator. We call it I. It's a throwaway variable. We always use it. We have multiple loops. We'll have I, then J, then K, then L, etc. Okay. We're using this built-in Python function called range. And the way it works is you can give it 1, 2, or 3 arguments, and it has some defaults. So if you give it 1 argument, that's going to be the stop argument, and the default start will be 0, and the default step will be 1. What are those, right? Okay, so the stop is what value do you stop just before? It's going to use a less than, not a less than or equal to, like we did up here. It's going to use a less than. So our stop, if I want to print from 1 to 10, our stop needs to be 11. Okay. Our start value is 1. And because range defaults to 0, I can't do this with just the 1 argument. I need to use at least 2. The default step is 1, and I put a 1 here for completeness, just so you can see that we can use all 3 arguments. That's it. So the range is going to basically create a list that follows that range, a list of numbers. And then the for loop is going to set I one at a time. It's going to set it equal to everything that's in this range. Okay. And then inside the loop, I can print the value of I. Remember, it's going to set I equal to each thing in the range one at a time and go through and loop every time. So when I print I, it's going to print 1 through 10. And then exit the loop. Okay, pretty simple. The for loop in Python is pretty powerful. In the future, we'll get to some pretty cool stuff that Python makes a lot simpler than other languages. That's not an endorsement of Python. Every language is suitable for whatever it's suitable for. All right, next we're going to do the same thing, but now we're going to count down from 10 to 1. This is the one I wrote first. That's why my variable is called countdown. I'm going to count down from 10 to 1. So I initialize my countdown variable to 10. And then I say, while countdown is greater than 0, do the stuff. Okay, so I print countdown, and then I say countdown minus equals 1. So some things to consider with while loops specifically is when I iterate my variable and I say countdown minus equals 1 or above when I say countdown plus equals 1, it is important to note whether I put that at the end of the loop body or at the beginning of the loop body, because it changes this print statement. It's going to be a different value if I changed countdown before the print statement or after the print statement. Okay, so that is a big factor in while loops. Sometimes you'll make a loop and you'll loop from 0 to 9, and inside your body you'll immediately add 1, and then inside the body of the loop you will reference the numbers 1 through 10. Totally fine. You just need to know what you're doing and make sure that you're using your iterator properly at either the top or the bottom of the loop body. Okay. Continuing on to the for loop, we're going to count down from 10 to 1. So the only thing that changes is how we build our range. Our start value, 10. Our stop value, 0. Remember, it's going to stop before it reaches that number. And our step is not 1, it's -1, so it counts down. Okay, that's it. That's our for loop going in the opposite directions. So those are loops. We could stop here and we kind of know how to write a loop, but we've only just dealt with counting numbers from 1 to 10. We can do other stuff with loops. What other stuff, you ask? Yeah, what other stuff can we do? Yeah, that's great. I'm a super good actor. Remember that. We can loop through and we can do anything that we could have put in an if statement. We can put in a loop condition and we can just keep on going. So now I'm going to get some input from the user, and I have a message for the user inside my loop body. Let's start by the loop body. Okay. So I've got an input value and I say, hey user, please input a Y to continue looping. So if I program this correctly, every time they hit Y, enter, it will loop again, and it will ask them to press Y to continue looping forever. Just like Homer Simpson pressing Y, enter, with triple his productivity. So let's program that. All right, so I'm going to initialize my input value to Y so that my loop will run at least once. Okay, I want it to run once. If I didn't do that, then it didn't run once, then maybe I need to do a do while if I don't know how to initialize my variables, but I do. So my loop condition is while this whole condition here, I'm going to say if the input value is equal to, double equal sign equal to, not the single equal sign assignment value, double equal sign comparison operator. If input value is equal to lowercase y, okay, string literal lowercase y in quotation marks, or if it's equal to uppercase y. Okay, because I'm going to be trying to be smarter than the user and say you could put in lowercase y, or if caps lock is on by mistake, you could put in uppercase y, and we're good either way. Okay. And you'll notice I have some of these things in single quotations and some of these things in double quotations. And why am I using one versus the other? For our purposes right now, strictly speaking, it doesn't matter which one I'm using. However, in this line right here specifically, I have quotation marks inside of quotation marks. If I use different quotes, if I use single ones inside of double or double ones inside of single, I'm pretty good to go. If I want to use the same quotes inside of quotes, that causes trouble. We can get around it by escaping things, but we haven't learned that quite yet, and it's not part of today's lesson. So some languages, the single quote and the double quote are very different. Some languages, they're slightly different, right? And for our purposes, we're not doing anything super advanced, so it really doesn't matter which one I use yet, okay? there we go. So I'm calling this my positive loop test. While this is true, keep looping and ask the user for the value. So if they put the value in, I found it, it's true, I keep looping. Next, we're going to do the same thing, but I'm going to call this my negative loop test. And instead of while something is true, I'm going to say while something is not false. You're like, but that equals true. It does. However, you'll see the difference. So input value initialization, still y, still the same. My loop condition has changed from, instead of saying, is the input value equal to y, I'm saying, is the input value not equal to n? And is it not equal to uppercase N? Okay, it has to be and. In the or case, I'm looking for, is it a lowercase y? No. Is it an uppercase y? Yes. It could be either one. It could never be both, right? You couldn't be uppercase y and lowercase y at the same time. You could never be both. And the bottom, if I had an or here, if it was lowercase n, is input value not equal to lowercase n? Let's say I typed in lowercase n. Well, it's equal to lowercase n, so that would be false. And if I had an or, it would say, is input value not equal to uppercase n? Well, lowercase n is not uppercase n, so that would be true. And then one of these would always be true and my loop wouldn't work right. It would just be an infinite loop all the time. So I need to say and in this case. It has to be not this one and also not this one. Okay. And so my message says, please input an n to stop looping. So the big difference there is the user presses n and enter, they stop looping. Great. You're like, that's kind of the same. In the first case, if I input a j, I stop looping because j is not y, and I'm looking for y to keep looping. Okay, you following? In the second case, if I input a j, it keeps looping because j is not n. Okay, it's not no. And anything that's not no is okay, and we keep looping. In the first case, anything that's not yes is a no, and we stop looping. In the second one, anything that's not no is a yes, and we keep looping. Okay, so why did I show you both of these things? You're going to make loops in the future, and it's very important that you have the kind of mental ability to think of both of these problems. Sometimes you're going to look for a value and all the rest of them don't matter. And you keep on doing, that's a positive. You say, this is a positive and everything else is a negative. And sometimes you say, well, this is a negative and anything else is a positive. Okay. And that's a big kind of, that's a big deal to kind of think about. So there's a simple way to think of it. Okay. Y and lowercase and uppercase y are a yes, and everything else is a no. And over here, lowercase and uppercase n are a no, and everything else is a yes. Okay. Great. Let's do one more type. Okay. We got two more loops here, and I'm going to take it to the very next level. We're going to input a number. Please input a number from 1 to 5 to continue looping. So we're looking for a value to continue looping. So this is another positive loop that I'm coming up with, right? I'm calling these positive loop conditions. And this time I'm using a specific variable as a controller, right? Instead of putting my conditional thing here, I'm setting a variable there, pre-initialized to true, so the loop does execute. I get my message, and then I do a test. And if it's true, then I do stuff. If it's false, the loop control equals false, and I leave the loop. Okay. Technically, I leave the loop up here, when it actually evaluates to false. But I know I put this last in my loop, and as soon as I set it to false, I'm done. Potentially could have more code in the loop here. We'll see that later. So input value, I'm inputting text up here and I'm inputting numbers up here. When you use this input command, you always get text. If I type in the number 2 in my input command, it's going to return the string literal of a number 2, not the integer of a number 2, the string literal of a number 2. I can't do math with a string literal. If it was on paper, I could do math with it. In a computer's memory, I can't do math with it. Okay? So I need to do something in order to be able to check that it's from 1 to 5. So I have a long if statement. All three of these things, there's ands, all three of these things have to be true. And if all of them are true, then I'm going to do stuff for my loop. First one, I'm using a built-in Python command isNumeric. Now this is a property or a method that belongs to this variable. I didn't create it, it's built into Python. Every variable has some methods that are built into them, okay? This one says isNumeric. Should be kind of self-evident what it does. It says, hey, is this value a number? Could be an integer, could be a floating point, could be a decimal number, right? But is it a number? There we go. Returns true if it's a numeric string, false otherwise, okay? A string is numeric if all characters in the string are numeric and there is at least one character. So if it's an empty string, not numeric. It has to be at least one character, and all of the characters have to be a numeric. If there's a space at the end of it, that is not numeric. All right, so if input value is a number, if that's true, and next, we're going to use this int here, and we're going to cast a number or a string to an integer, okay? What this does is it temporarily will take whatever value I put in there and cast it as an integer. It will say, okay, this group, this whole thing right here that I'm using, this is now an integer. I have to do the isNumeric first, because if it's not numeric and I try to do this part, I get a runtime error and it breaks my program. So I check if it's a number. Remember, if statements, things happen in order from left to right. So if this one is true, then we have the and then we do the next one. So the next one is, okay, I know it's a number already. Cast it as an actual integer. Okay, if it had a decimal point in there, it would still be numeric. And what the cast does is it just forgets whatever's after the decimal point, turns it into an integer, which is great for me. I'm fine with that in this case. Okay, is that number greater than or equal to 1? If it's yes, we go to the next one, and we're going to do it again. We're going to cast that input value as an integer. It's already cast as an integer once. We can do it again. Also important to note that this casting is not a permanent thing. It just does it. We use the value. It's gone. If I wanted to save it, I could set up a different variable and assign it as the casted value. I could do that. I'm not doing it here. I'm just casting again. And I'm saying, is this casted value greater than or less than or equal to 5? Okay, so long stuff, right? I've asked the user to input a number from 1 to 5. Input always comes in as a string literal. So if I typed in the number 1 and press enter, I need to say, is that a number? If it is it greater than or equal to 1? And if it is it less than or equal to 5? And I need ands in here, all of them, because let's say I input the number 6, okay? It's a number, it's greater than or equal to 1, but it's not less than or equal to 5. Okay. That's not in the range that I'm looking for. Let's say I put in the number -1. It's a number, it's not greater than or equal to 5, but it is less than or equal to 5. Okay, so I need ands. All three of those have to be true. If they're all true, this is where I'd put the stuff in here, which is in my if statement body. It's also, all of this is within my loop body. Okay. If any one of these values in my if condition turn out to be false, then I slide down here to the else clause of my if statement and I set loop control equal to false. That's the end of my loop. Loop control equals false and the loop stops. Okay. So positive condition, I have checked for number input, right? And not only did I check for number input, but I checked for a whole range of numbers. Next, we're going to do a little simpler. We're going to do the negative test. We're not going to check for a range of numbers this time. We did that once. We're fine. We're going to check for a specific number this time. A little easier. The negative loop, if they give us a number, that's when we stop. If they give us anything else, we keep going. Okay? So if they say stop, we stop. If they say anything else, we keep going. In the first one, they have to say, yeah, I guess it's a question of consent, right? In the first one, they have to say yes to keep going, and anything else is a stop. And then the second one, they can say stop to stop, and anything else is keep going. That took a turn. Anyway, please input a 2 to stop looping. Okay, I have the same, my while loop is governed by my loop control variable. It's initialized to true, so I'm inside my while loop. All the control of my while loop is happening on the inside of it again, right? I have my if statement. I get my input. Is it numeric? I have to test if it's numeric again. Remember, our inputs always come in as a string literal. If it's numeric, and I'm specifically looking for 2 this time, is it equal to 2? If that's true, that's when I want to stop. That's my stop condition. Loop control equals false. All right. If nobody said stop, they said what anything else but stop, we're going down here, and this is where we're going to do stuff in our code. And that's it. All right. Hopefully you could follow along with all of this from the very first loop all the way down. If not, watch the video again. Give me some bonus points. All right. That's all I got for you. Again, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.